Hello, you're listening to the Public Rail Now podcast. I'm your host, Adam Barrington. On this episode, I talk with Via Rail passenger train worker and national member organizer for Unifor's Get Canada Back on Track campaign, Christopher Graper. We discuss strike preparation, the struggle against privatization of Via Rail, bargaining with crown corporations, cross-border solidarity, and more. For more information about Unifor, Canada's largest private sector union, please visit unifor.org. And for more information about the Public Rail Now campaign, please visit publicrailnow.org. Thanks for listening and enjoy.
I got involved with Unifor because I'm a member. I work on board Via Rail. I'm a senior service attendant in our corridor operations, and I'm based out of the Toronto terminal. So that's how I became a member of Unifor. I got involved because, I want to make our workplace better, of course, and in a larger sense, I'm also concerned about broader public transportation issues and how unionized members can help try to advocate for improvements to public transportation. Unifor is a national union here in Canada, comprising workers from a number of different sectors from all three coasts. And rail is obviously a very important one. We have members at CN and CP and Via Rail, of course. But that's how I got involved in Unifor. That's what Unifor is. And I've had about a 6-year history as an officer within the union. I started as a grievance officer, and then I moved up to local chairperson. And I've worked, in addition to the advocacy role, working with Get Canada Back on Track, I've also worked as the national strike coordinator for our strike efforts, if and when we're in negotiations, which we are this year, as it happens.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I actually wanted to ask you, to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong, but Unifor and IBEW, I think earlier this year, both issued strike notices, Unifor against CPKC and IBEW against CN, both with overwhelming support from the union membership. So from my understanding, the tentative agreements have been reached with both employers. But in terms of Unifor and CPKC, what were the primary issues that workers wanted to see addressed and in the new collective bargaining agreement? And do you think that CPKC has met Unifor's demands?
Oh, I'm not the best person to ask. I can speak as a member just based on kind of what I know from my sisters and brothers in the field and from what I've heard, but I'm not an expert on that, to be honest with you. I know that there were a number of concerns at CPKC about contracting out of work, about working conditions, of course, technology issues, right? These big scanners they want to bring in to replace Carmen and that type of stuff, and all the safety issues and everything else that comes along with that. But if I'm being honest, I'm not as well versed with that end of it. Oftentimes, I was working as the strike coordinator for those strikes, but by the time it's gotten to me, I'm often the issues are the people working at the table are at the table, and I'm working to get everybody organized across the country to start walking or to start having a strike presence. So I may not be the best person to ask about that part.
No, yeah, no worries. I mean, as working as like a strike coordinator, what does that process look like? Because like I said, just generally with the strikes both having overwhelming support from membership, what do those conversations look like with workers? How do you kind of, build that enthusiasm for taking action in the workforce?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll speak to Via because I've going to be working. This is going to be coming up on my second possible negotiation period that could end in a strike or a lockout action. The last time was in 2022, and at Via, I can tell you we had 99% support for strike action if necessary. I think at that time we were just out of the pandemic, or nearly out of the pandemic, and I think major concerns were around wages and around inflation. I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out this time around. But for me as a strike coordinator, that role is really unique, especially because we're talking about a national job site, right? We're not talking, when you think of a strike action, it's kind of easy to think about it. Okay, there's a little factory and, the workers want better treatment or better wages or whatever. And so they've walked out until they get their deal, or they've been locked out until the employer gets their deal. But here in a national sense, like, we really have to cat herd right across the country and get everybody together. And how do you do that? Well, not everybody is immediately interested to go out and strike. But I think the most important thing is really being well prepared and being well organized. And that's what my role really is. It's having the conversations with the union representatives on the ground, getting them to get their people together, to get organized, to start thinking about what you're going to need if you're going to be out on the line for a long time, and changing that theoretical type of idea about what happens if we go out on strike one day to, okay, team, we got to get this to the point where in, T-minus 2 weeks, we got to be ready to go out. And what gets people together, I think the reality of the economic situation more than anything else. I mean, you're always going to have a certain amount of people who are not interested to take any kind of job action. You're always going to have some people who are extremely interested to take job action. And most of the people are in the middle. And I think people realize that collective bargaining is the best route forward to get a better result, and that they do need to support the bargaining committee. And one of the ways to do that is by offering a strike vote and being ready if we do need to go out. I'm happy to say at VIA, we've never needed to do that, at least not in my working history. But we were ready in 2022, and the company knew it, and that aided us significantly in our bargaining efforts in a way that I think the vast majority of the membership was happy with, or at least reasonably so.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I think it's especially for folks outside of labor. There may be this impression that when there's a strike action that could potentially come about, everybody's just enthusiastic about it and we're rah rah ready to go. But it's a pretty daunting task. You have to prepare. Like, there's a lot of considerations. Is like, well, how am I going to afford rent, or how am I going to feed my family and things like that? Like, it's a huge risky step that workers have to take. So it for folks like you that are really at the forefront of building that enthusiasm and that solidarity, and letting everybody know that we're all in this together, and having this feeling of sort of mutual care about each other, and supporting each other. That's a hard job in a lot of cases. Like, that can be a hard sell. Like,
Yeah.
and yeah.
It can be. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it certainly can be. And, strike pay is not, it certainly doesn't match what we would make if we were working on the train and serving our passengers, right? It's significantly less than that. It's a modest stopgap measure during a period of job action. But at the end of the day, I mean, people got to pay their bills, and it's hard. Once you've walked out, you're out there, and you're probably going to be out there for a week or two at a minimum once you've gone out. And so my sort of feeling, and the way that I've tried to navigate this, at least with my members, is to say, look, we need to be organized. The company does well when we look like we're not organized and we don't know what we're doing. So let's get organized. And we're in a unique position being railway like onboard passenger employees, because we do a lot of logistical work and a lot of organizing people in our day-to-day lives, right? We're very good at working in teams and working through the chain of command and establishing roles. Like, we do that every day on the train. So in a certain sense, we're actually very adept at that type of thing, especially for the onboard crew and those working in stations and stuff like that are actually, passenger facing, frontline customer service. We're good at that type of thing. Maybe perhaps so than in some of the trades and some other stuff where it's a little bit more difficult to get people together. But at the end of the day, at VIA, we were still able to get a very good critical mass and a 99% strike vote, and then a ratification vote, which was quite high in 2022. I don't remember the exact number, but it was above 90 or 95%, if I remember correctly.
Especially in terms of VIA Rail, what does that negotiation process look like? I know there's this big effort, and I think it's pretty much a done deal at this point as far as efforts to privatize VIA Rail. But given that it's at least at the moment, maybe it's like a public utility, it's a public service. What is there? Are there any unique characteristics like that might be different than maybe like the Teamsters negotiating with a private employer versus how Unifor negotiates with Via Rail? Like, what does that look like?
Oh gosh, yeah, that's a multi-layered question. There's a lot there for sure. It is different for a number of reasons. First of all, because it is a state-owned railway, which we would here in Canada call a crown corporation. It means that the government of Canada is the single shareholder, and because of that, it is a highly politicized environment. I'm speaking generally here, by the way. I'm not on our bargaining committee, although I work closely with them, of course. But speaking generally, we have to be conscious of the federal government situation, the national government here in Canada. We have to be aware of those political situations because they really influence our work significantly in a way that, yes, of course, in all industries are influenced by politics, of course, but really, our boss is the transport minister of Canada. And because of that, we have to be very careful and we have to be very conscious, strategically speaking, of what how the political winds are blowing, let's say. You touched upon privatization. And that, again, is another thing that is a big part of the political winds. You're correct that the government's stated plan is to privatize at least the corridor operations of Via Rail. And that has been the stated policy going back to 2022 when the federal government took away the high-frequency rail program from Via Rail and made it a federal initiative under Transport Canada. Part and parcel of that plan was to privatize the corridor and hand it over to a private operator. Now, as things have kind of developed here since 2022, we have seen that the government has moved away from a high-frequency rail plan towards a high-speed rail network called ALTO, ALTO, ALTO. And because of that, on the one hand, we still have privatization of the existing operation being the stated goal of the government. However, we don't have any clear date about when that might happen. There's significant question given a price tag for high-speed rail of about $80 billion to $120 billion and a 20-year construction timeline. At this point, it's basically an open question about when any kind of a handover to a private operator might happen. And really where we're at right now is kind of in limbo. We don't know when privatization is going to happen. It's been stated through, requests for expression of interest that's the government's intention. But ultimately, a lot of things really seem up in the air right now. And the frustration there is we've got, some interesting plans for new rail services, but some long-term strategic, protracted underfunding of the existing network that is making passengers and workers suffer now, that is compromising the flexibility of the network to achieve its best goals or its best features, let's say, today. And that's kind of the question that we find ourselves asking is like, okay, well, you're going to have a high-speed network in 20 years. Great. What are we going to do for the next 20 years? And when are we going to start investing in new equipment and repairing the equipment we have to better serve passengers, right? So, again, that's, just tying this all up, you have to be conscious of a lot. It's not easy. It's not just worrying about, in fact, we never worry about corporate profit because there isn't any. We navigate political wins in a way that I suppose a lot of unions don't really have to.
Yeah, I mean that really a lot of what you said is I just was starting to think about what I've heard from railroad workers here in terms of the situation with Amtrak. But before I kind of start asking about that and cross border solidarity and how what workers are experiencing in Canada really is like a mirror image of what's happening in the United States as well. But I wanted to kind of pick your brain about the high speed rail aspect of this situation because I was just reading this article from last February. NDP warns privatizing high speed rail from Toronto to Quebec could kill passenger trains in the rest of Canada, and it mentions that 80% of Via Rail's revenue could be lost to high speed replacement. And I hear that a lot here, where there's a lot of enthusiasm about high speed rail, and it's kind of like you're saying, well, yeah, that you can have that like down the road or whatever, but what exactly are you doing now? So I kind of wanted to see what your thoughts were about that sort of looming the killing of passenger trains in the rest of Canada as a result of this high speed rail replacement.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, as I say, I think we're experiencing, in a certain sense, some protracted underfunding for many years of Via Rail, and the impacts of that are felt every time you ride on a Via Rail train, and it's a bumpy ride. Well, that's because our equipment dates back to the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1980s and the 1990s, right? So there's that aspect to it. The government, I think, feels that they can continue operations across the country without the corridor being the main driver of those operations. Most of the lines are separated in terms of their funding. So in other words, the corridor really doesn't go to pay off the losses in the rest of the country in a direct way, in the same way that it might have done in the 70s or the 80s when the company was first formed. So that is to say that the additional the operations outside of the corridor can continue and probably will continue because many of them are essential services. And what that means here in Canada and in the context of Via Rail is that there's about 6 routes within Canada where the federal government has determined that it's more cost beneficial to run a train to remote areas than to build a road. And those 6 lines are Prince Rupert to Jasper, Winnipeg to Churchill, Winnipeg to Capriol, which is the Canadian, the Sudbury White River line, and the trains from Montreal to Jonquière and Saint-Nazaire, respectively. So will those services continue to run? Yeah, they probably will, because they're literally needed and literally carrying essential services. The question is, will they be promoted to international tourists? Will they be abstracted from the rest of the Via Rail network? Will it be a service that just provides the bare minimum that has to be there to a local community? Or will it be part of a dynamic solution, green solution to encourage tourism within Canada and green travel within Canada? Those are the types of concerns we see. We as employees on board, we want to see more Via everywhere. We want to see a railway that has a mandate and a budget to increase passenger services across the country and to meet demand that already exists, and to be a forward-thinking, dynamic type of organization, perhaps more like what we've seen from Amtrak over the last 16 years or so, which has been doing reasonably well. I think one of the biggest problems, and one of the things that our campaign at Unifor focuses on, is via, unlike Amtrak, we don't have a real mandate, right? I've said before, we run the trains that the transport minister tells us to run, and that's pretty much true. Via Rail doesn't have a mandate. It doesn't have an established budget, and it certainly doesn't have things like track priority or dispatch priority or anything like that. So in some ways, that's, every railway, of course, has its challenges, and Via has a lot of great things about it, and some things that could be improved. Amtrak, the same thing, right? The one thing I'll say that's good about Amtrak is, at least at the executive level over the last 15 years-ish or so, there has been a real push to improve, to expand, to increase ridership, to increase efficiency, to make things better. And, although during the mid 2010s, Via had probably, let's say 2015 to 2020 were some of the best years that Via has ever had, the most trains, the most passengers ever. Since 2020, things have slid, quickly downhill, unfortunately. And the railway at this point really lacks a vision, really lacks investment. And it's a shame, because people want more trains right across the country. And it's very difficult to get anywhere by public transport in Canada outside of major cities. So there's really a market there, and there's really a demand, but unfortunately we can't seem to get these services to the people that want it most. And that's unfortunate.
Absolutely. And I wanted to ask, I mean, you said a lot of great things about Amtrak, but it's kind of like it hurts to hear it right now, because of, we've got Elon Musk saying, "Oh, we got to privatize Amtrak," and even wants to privatize the USPS and all of that. But who in Canada is behind this effort to privatize Via Rail? I mean, what do they want out of it? And you kind of talked about it a little bit, but how are efforts like privatization going to impact workers and passengers in Canada?
Well, I mean, it's different because it's not an ideological political move, as opposed to someone like Elon Musk, who or the new administration in the U.S., I should say, that's ideologically committed to, private industry and the breaking apart of public industries. It isn't quite like that. It's more under the kind of public-private partnership philosophy, if you could put it that way. It's more being approached as part of the P3 model for major infrastructure programs. It's being approached as a kind of rationalization of the services. And as I say, in Canada, it's despite it being the stated plan, it's abstracted way into the future. So while we're all concerned about it today, and we were concerned about it from 2022 up until today, at this point, we still don't know when it's going to happen. It certainly won't happen till the end of the planning stage of the Alto high-speed rail plan. And that's another 5 or 6 years down the road. So as it stands, we're sort of trundling along with what we have and making do. And we don't really know what the future is. But, our issue is, as you say, the way it's going to impact employees and the way it's going to impact passengers. People are just clamoring for more public transport options right across the country, and they can't get them. That's frustrating. It's frustrating for me as an advocate. It's frustrating for advocates across the country. As an employee, it's frustrating because we want to serve more communities and we want to have this service provided to places that need it. And in my estimation, the real issue is that here in, at least here in Canada, there's not a lot of democracy in the governance of Via Rail. Passengers and workers don't really have a seat at the table when it comes to Via Rail operations. If you would like to see improved services for your community, you could talk to your MP, that's your minister of or your parliamentary representative, kind of like your congressman or your senator or something like that. But they aren't likely to have too much import on getting trains to run to communities where they currently don't run. Or you could, appeal to the board of directors, or you could write a letter or something. But all of this, is very far away from governance and from policy. And unfortunately, the reality is that passengers and workers are very far abstracted from operational and strategic policy at Via Rail. And that's unfortunate. I think in our campaign believes that there needs to be guiding legislation, what we would call an act here, a Via Rail Act, that really gives a mandate, that gives a budget, and that says to the railway and to the government that this is where we're going. We're looking to increase service right across the country. And the budget is not going to be a political one to do it. It's going to be part of the regular operations of how we're making public transit better in Canada. A seat on the board of directors for both a passenger representative and a worker representative, I feel, is absolutely critical. And investment in services. These are critical aspects that haven't been there for a long time. And if Via is really to get to the point where it really serves the need of the Canadian traveling public, and for the public that wants to travel by train, they're going to need to have these types of supporting legislation and funding to achieve that, in my estimation.
Yeah, definitely. And is there has Unifor in any other unions in Canada or community organizations, is there any kind of unified front that's been built to kind of connect passengers, or maybe environmentalists, or anybody who's passenger rail advocates, anybody like, is there any effort like to build that sort of, maybe from the ground up, grassroots kind of instrument of pressure in order to get some of the things that you were just talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's certainly like the main efforts of our campaign at Unifor are really trying to work on that. I think one of the political realities is that we're sort of in between governments right now. That is to say, we're in an election period, and we expect to have a new government probably by the end of the month, roughly speaking. But practically speaking, for the last year or so, when it comes to policy, there hasn't been too much opportunity to advocate, because it was clear that the government was on its way out and we were heading towards election, right? But before that, our campaign had been working to try and get a big tent together, essentially, of environmental advocates and public transport advocates and industry advocates and municipal leaders, right? Because that's another big piece of this puzzle here, is that especially small and mid-sized communities right across Canada are struggling to get people to doctor's appointments in other communities, 2 towns over, or into the major city for surgeries, or how do you get grandma home for Christmas, right, when there's 2 feet of snow everywhere? How does that happen exactly? And the options are becoming more and more limited and becoming more and more centralized in major cities, and smaller communities are seeing less and less benefit and less opportunity to be able to travel within a public network. And rail is uniquely suited to smaller communities, and it's already there in in many instances. I used to joke, imagine if only the federal government owned a railway. Oh wait, it does. We can bring service to a lot of places. It just takes public will, and it takes funding, and it takes getting people together. And I think there's an opportunity to do that. I've certainly tried my best to get a lot of people together, and I think we've done an admirable job in many ways. There's a lot more that could be done, and it's a big country. And one of the challenges, we don't have as many people as you do in the States, and it's harder to and more expensive, just on an economy of scale type of understanding to bring these things together.
When we first started talking about connecting Unifor and our campaign for public ownership of the rails here, a lot of that discussion pertained to cross-border solidarity and how can we get Canadian railroad workers and U.S. railroad workers and Mexican railroad workers essentially building this North American cross-border movement of railroad workers. And I wanted to ask you, like, in what ways have you already seen that? Like, I know, for example, like we've got Teamsters, even though headquartered technically in the U.S., but also a lot of Teamsters are in Canada as well. So just in general, like, what have you already seen in terms of cross-border solidarity, and in what ways can railroad workers and the people that support them, again, like passenger rail advocates, public transportation folks, and like, what can we do to enhance those relationships that already exist, and in what ways can we start building more in stronger connections, across these borders?
It's a great question, and it's a question that's a little bit harder to answer these days, just given the dramatic transformation of the relationship, at least between between all three countries, really, between the U.S. and Canada and Mexico. I would say let's considering just recent history, I think that I think that the railroads and railroaders understand the interconnectedness, literally and figuratively, of what we do every day, right? And it's challenging to do that in a cross-border way. When it comes to finding solidarity within Canada, we've worked with other unions, including the Teamsters, and a number of other public transport unions, such as the ATU, who are all supporters of our campaign. And we've done some joint calls together and some cross promotion together and that type of thing. When it comes to the U.S. side and our sisters and brothers at Amtrak, for example, and many of the commuter railways across the country, I think we have a lot of commonality because we're facing common threats against public infrastructure. I really think of, and I hope I'm not misspeaking, but I think that the situation we've kind of seen with the MBTA in Boston is kind of similar to the future of what Via Rail is facing. And it's, the MBTA is not unique in that sense, but really what you have is a public service, long established, being, the operation, being handed over, let's say, in terms of an operational contract with a guarantee of profit to private operators. And, the questions that come along with that of the public good and about wise investment in public services. Why is it better for a private operator to be making a guarantee of profit? Why are we paying 9 or 10% as part of these contracts when we can do it, and it's been done historically by the public sector without issue, right? So the questions are often very similar. I think, we're kind of going into an era in the Trump era of this kind of shock and awe capitalism, and it's hard to know where we are exactly. But I think one of the biggest things that we all have to double down on right now is awareness of our commonality, of our shared fight, right? Like my fight is Amtrak's fight. I feel a solidarity with my sisters and brothers that work at Amtrak. Beyond the solidarity, I mean, our terminal actually works. The Maple Leaf, we work that train from Niagara Falls, Ontario to Canada. We work that equipment daily. And we, hand the train off to our American colleagues. And, to me, it's not an abstract concept at all. It's absolutely a lived concept every day. And I think that needs to be important as we try and navigate all this uncertainty. But then, when you think of the bigger picture, right? Like Via Rail and Amtrak are both openly working on reconnecting a line from Chicago to Toronto. And all of us on both sides of the border, advocates, employees, everybody should be big time behind this proposal, which is really exciting, right? That, Amtrak is going to make use of new trackage rights that they got after the CPKC merger. They're going to be able to go through the Windsor Tunnel. They're going to serve Detroit and Windsor with a through service to Chicago. I mean, that's an admirable fight that has a lot of support on both sides of the border, from advocates, from municipalities, and I think there's a lot of opportunities for solidarity there. And again, as we navigate all this uncertainty, I think it's important to just be aware and be cognizant of what's possible and what those challenges are.
Yeah, and my penultimate question actually has to do with that as well, which is, given that politics and industrial relations are shifting to the right, in the United States very blatantly, but also to some degree in Canada as well. What do you foresee as the primary tasks ahead for railroad workers and their unions? What can folks in the audience, people who are listening, what can they do to support railroad workers in Unifor throughout Canada and throughout North America to help support all the things that you've just talked about? Building that solidarity, preserving the sort of like the commons, basically, like things that are a public good, that serve the community, that serve the public, that everybody who relies on it is very much invested in. What can folks do to assist us in this fight? And I guess, what are the priorities in your mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think your organization has been really excellent for that, in a certain sense, for people who really care about, preserving and improving public infrastructure, rail infrastructure. I can personally say that I've learned a lot from your organization about similar battles that are happening in other parts of the world, right? I think that it's challenging these days, especially because we're all, in the algorithm. Let's say it's hard to work towards collating all of the important fights that are happening across the country and why they matter. It's getting harder and harder to do that. And so I think an organization like yours is important in that. And I think all organizations, including Unifor in our campaign, have an opportunity to try and collate as much solidarity as possible. I think the reality is, the challenges, I mean, we're feeling all the challenges. We're approaching fascism certainly in the United States and a lot of parts of the world. And the public is undervalued. The public sphere is undervalued in a lot of ways. I think taking the train in that context becomes an active resistance in a certain way, certainly an act of awareness. But I think there's an opportunity, like I say, to get people who care together, and to not just do it in a silo, right? Not just railroaders, not just environmentalists, not just bicycle advocates, not just senior tourism groups, right? All of the people that could benefit from the train, from all backgrounds, all interests, all everything, should be working to advocate with a single voice as much as possible, in my opinion. And that's a huge challenge, right? These are diverse groups to try and get together. However, I really believe that ultimately, if you want to try and arrive at the critical mass of support that's required to get these kind of major projects, public infrastructure projects going or refunded, that's really what it takes. And there's a lot of examples of success out there, but it's not easy. It's not easy, I can tell you.
Yeah, well said. And yeah, it definitely is not easy, but it's imperative work. And um, I want to express my appreciation and Public Rail Now's appreciation for your time and all the work that you do. Unifor has been an exceptional ally, and I look forward to working more with you and your sisters and brothers in Unifor. But before we go, where can folks go to learn more about Unifor, and how can people support the work that you do and get involved in a more tangible way?
Well, yeah, for sure. I would invite people to check out our website. That would be my first suggestion. I think once a government is formed here, I think Unifor is going to be doubling down on some of our initiatives that we were working on most recently. Again, that's collating as much support from different sectors as possible, and also petitioning the government to work towards a Via Rail Act, towards having a worker and a passenger representative on the board of directors, and increasing investment in Via and increasing services right across the country. That's really what we want to see, and if people are able to check out our website and sign our petitions, that's a great step to promoting awareness and working towards those goals. Certainly something anybody can do from the convenience of their home, wherever they might be in the world.
Excellent. Christopher, thank you so much. And I look forward to talking with you again. Thank you so much for your time. And again, yes, please check out Unifor's website. Get involved, especially if you're in Canada. Can't say enough good things about these folks. And I again look forward to working with Unifor in the future. And thank you all for listening. And again, Christopher, thank you so much.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And solidarity with all my sisters and brothers right across the country, right across the world. Railway workers, we all have more in common than we have in different. And you have my full support, sisters and brothers. All the best, everybody. Take care.